It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
Is it possible that there are no coincidences?
What have we done?
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
You must unlearn what you have learned.
Welcome, everyone, to the Cast 'Em Off Radio Fringe Files. I'm your host, Brandon Schwinn, and this is episode number 7 of our Fringe Files program. Good news for all you Fringe Files lovers out there. We are ramping it up. It has been, when we've done this show in the past, it has been pretty sporadic. Just whenever I felt like bringing a guest on that I could trust, and it really wasn't my main focus this show. But we're changing gears. I'm actually going to be focusing on this show and Cast 'Em Off Radio as well. So if you've only watched this program, if you've never watched Cast 'Em Off Radio, I would encourage you to check that out. But we are going to start ramping up the Fringe Files. I'm going to try to do a weekly program as much as possible. And we're going to start off start working towards our 101 series of shows, which is basically... we're going to bring guys that I trust, guys that have been around for a long time, and we're going to talk about topics on a college level 101 kind of introduction. And it's going to be for all of you out there who are new to the whole idea of the alien deception or the occult or things like that. Our goal is to give you a starting point, a base, and allow you to work from there. And so we've got an amazing lineup. For the 101 series, I have William Ramsey coming on and Jim Wilhelmsen. Richard Shaw is lined up to come on and talk about the Tor codes. And we also have Ali Sayadatin. I hope I got that name right. I apologize if I didn't. But he's going to come on and talk about his movie that they've just recently done. I think in here within the last year. He's also going to talk about the new movie that they have coming up as well. I think just maybe give you a hint on that. So that is just a taste of the guests that we have lined up. I'm working very hard to get a very solid group of guests that we can all learn from. We're going to try to take things from a different point of view than what they've done in other programs as much as possible. But what my goal is, and always has been with Fringe Files, is to give you guys some place to start. A lot of you who are new to the whole idea of the fringe Christian world or anything like that, I want you to have something that you can start and then move from there. There's so many great programs out there that cover the kind of topics we're going to cover, but some of them are on a much deeper level. And so we want to give you that base. We want to give you that starting point. And basically it's going to be like an archive that's going to be there forever, where people can go back and check it out and reference. And that's going to be the goal with this. So I'm really excited. It's been a long time since to build up to where we're at now. I mean, obviously we've only done 7 of the Fringe Files in a year, but that is going to change. I'm to the point, guys, where I'm recording every night. I'm recording Cast 'Em Off Radio. I'm recording the Forge Through Faith program. I'm going to be recording Cast 'Em Off Radio Fringe Files, and then I'm also doing producing for some other shows on the Fringe Radio Network. For those of you who don't know, right now Johnny from The Iron Show and myself have purchased the Fringe Radio Network, and we're working very hard to build up the roster, to build up the quality, to just bring in some amazing talent, to up the quality of everybody, and to start offering video content, just really bringing it to the cutting edge as much as we can. And so if you are not subscribed to the Fringe Radio Network YouTube page, get subscribed. Just go to YouTube and type in Fringe Radio Network, and please subscribe to that page. The same goes for the Cast 'Em Off Radio YouTube page. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube page yet, please do that, because pretty much all of our shows that come out now are on video, including this one. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Google Play and you want to watch the actual episode, guys, go over to YouTube and go to castemoffradio.com or Cast 'Em Off Radio. Type in Cast 'Em Off Ministries on YouTube, and you will find the program. You can watch Forged Through Faith on there. You can watch Cast 'Em Off Radio. You can watch this show. And then you can also go to the Fringe Radio Network and watch all the same shows. All of our shows are on that network, as well as Spiritual Encounters with Casper McLeod is now in video. And many of the other shows are going to be moving in that direction. We're working very hard into the video platform because that really honestly is the future. So I'm excited, guys. If you're looking at this in video, you see my eyes are all red and messed up. I've been mowing the last 2 days in 20-mile-an-hour winds, and so it's just been a constant barrage of dust and dirt and nasty stuff in my eyes, and it's tearing me up pretty bad. Excuse me there, I had to get a swig of coffee. It's a little bit late. It's Friday night, and I'm wiped out. I'm trying to adjust to this new schedule, and it's been pretty cool. I love recording, and now that it's fall or moving into winter, I'll have a lot more time to do what I love to do, which is to produce content and to dig into the Word of God and get quality programming out there. One thing that Fringe Files is always going to be about is staying God-centered. Okay, there's a lot of shows out there that do paranormal, fringe Christian, stuff like that, but we will always stay God-centered on this show. And I'm also not going to bring on anything that I don't believe in. I'm sorry, but, I'm not going to promote ideas that I think are false. I'm not going to I'm just not going to do it. There's a lot of programs that don't mind bringing people on just for the sake of exploring ideas. That's not this show. I am not going to bring anything on that I think is dangerous to a new Christian or that I think is dangerous to an old Christian. I think there's a lot of things that have infiltrated our fringe community that are very dangerous. I think they're psyops. I think they're purposely put in there. I'm not going to name them, but I'm pretty sure you can probably figure that out for yourself, considering the things I've talked about in the past, probably. So anyway, guys, big things coming. I'm excited. We are really going to start moving Fringe Files into the right direction. It's really going to become a big thing. And so be looking for that. Tonight on this show, I'm joined, I think this is the fourth time, by Gary Wayne. Gary Wayne is an author. He's a lecturer. He's a researcher. He's an amazing guy. I love when Gary comes on the show. I love all our guests, but Gary's been on here a lot. And the cool thing about when Gary comes on is, Gary can go on any show and on every show talk about a different subject. He wrote the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And it's an amazing book, Genesis6conspiracy.com. Go check it out. Get a copy if you don't have it. It's a great reference material. I would hold my copy up, but my son has it at school. And he's 14. It is the kind of book that anybody can pick up and read and get something out of. And I don't pump things for the sake of pumping things. I truly think that the Genesis 6 Conspiracy is a book that everybody needs in their research library. It's that important. It has 30 years of research, guys. 30 years of research is what it took to make this book. And Gary Wayne is one of those guys that he can carry the show. He literally has so much information that I don't have to ask a lot of questions because he's so good at just laying it all out there. And so tonight we're talking about the Essenes. And I'm going to be honest, coming into this program, I didn't know a lot about them. And I sure as heck didn't know that they were the root of many of the secret societies that we have today. Just a very fascinating conversation. And Gary believes that they go all the way back to the antediluvian pre-flood time. And so, just like I said, fascinating conversation. You guys are really going to enjoy the interview. So just stay tuned. The interview with Gary Wayne is up next. Joining me tonight is author, researcher, and lecturer Mr. Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary, welcome back to the show.
So happy to be back and so happy to be talking about the subject we're going to discuss tonight, because I think it is one of those key connect-the-dot organizations and religion that people know so little about, and yet also affects us in ways that people hadn't really thought of, and people are probably very much unaware of who these people are, even though they're starting to read a lot of their works and their documents.
Excellent. Yeah, I am. I'm actually very excited for tonight because I do not know a lot of information about the group we're talking about, and that group is going to be, if I can get my stuff to work right, that group is going to be the Essenes. The little that I do know is that they are an ancient Jewish sect that is very much involved, interwoven throughout your book and throughout what you talk about, and very much a part of it, and especially in chapters 83 and 84 of your book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, which if you do not have it, you need to get it. Before we get going, though, I want people to understand where they can find your book. They can go to Amazon. They can go to Barnes & Noble, Genesis6conspiracy.com. You can actually get a signed copy from Gary himself. I actually have one, and I feel pretty special about it. And you can also go to find Gary, Facebook and Twitter. Normally I would sit there and I would hold Gary's book and I would hold it up and I would say, see, this is the book that you need to go get. Well, I was looking for the book before the interview and come to find out that my son is actually reading the Genesis 6 Conspiracy and has it at school. He's 14. So that just goes to show you it doesn't matter what age you are. This is a book that all age groups can understand, and you will get something out of it, everybody. No matter if you're the layperson to the doctor, you will get something out of it. So let's get into it tonight, Gary. Like I said, it's chapters 83 and 84 in the book. If people want to pull their Genesis 6 Conspiracy out, pull up those chapters and follow kind of along and loosely follow. But who were the Essenes, and why are they so significant in history?
Yeah, and they really do come in at the crossroads of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy at the time of Jesus and before. And most people, I think some of them have heard of the Essenes, but they don't really understand where they position themselves in Judaic society at the time of Jesus. And so in the Bible, we hear a lot being discussed about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and those were two of the three religious groups of Judaic society of that time. And so the Essenes, though, aren't mentioned by name, although maybe a little bit later on I'll talk about a couple of references to the Essenes that Paul and Jesus are likely talking about the Essenes. But the Essenes were a rogue cult of Judaic society. Even though they had priests that were on the elder council in the temple in Jerusalem, they were not a monotheistic organization. And it's really important to understand this because they are the key to the secret societies as we know them today. And they're also the key to the writings that people are starting to get more and more immersed into. And the writings that I'm talking about come out of the Qumran community in the Dead Sea. So when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, or we're talking about Gnostic Gospels, whether it's the Gnostic Gospel of Mary Magdalene or of Judas, or any of these other parallel Gospels written at a similar time of the Gospels of Christianity, understand these are from a polytheist perspective.
So this is a very, very important group, because the Dead Sea Scrolls is one of the biggest finds in Christian history, but it also brought in a lot of extracurricular activity into what we do, especially into our fringe community here. There's a lot of people who have read into some of these extra canonical books and have gone another direction. And so, yeah, I can see where this group would play a very important part in history, especially in the church.
Yeah, because they wrote a parallel gospel that does not raise Jesus to deity status. Mm-hmm. They recognized and draft Jesus as part of their movement and as a prophet and enlightened, and maybe even as the teacher of righteousness, as a lot of the Qumran writings will say, just as they draft James and John the Baptist as being an Essene as well. But they have a different concept of who Jesus and John the Baptist and James were and what they did. And so when we see these other gospels that are being raised up to, most people will first bring them out and say, well, it tells us more about that period, perhaps. But what it tells us about is this rival group that were persecuted into submission and underground by Roman Catholicism when that took form, 300 years later at the implementation and conversion of Constantine, who also plays a bit of a part in their later history as well. So it's very, very important to understand that who these people were, not just the allegations that I'm making as to who they were, but, let's, fully to discuss them tonight, describe who they are, and also how they connect into the secret societies, because that is such a key part as to how the end time will come about and all the different sort of organizations going on and working in this world today that are really trying to bring about world government and a universal religion.
Sure. And we're seeing some very interesting things right now, especially with the latest election here in the States. It seems like the world is pushing back against this new world order machine. How long it's going to last, I don't know. I mean, I really feel like, in my opinion, that this was a reprieve. This is God saying, here's your chance. What are you going to do with it? And that's going to be us getting on our knees and repenting and turning away from the things that we've done for 30, 40, 50 years. But that doesn't mean they're ever going to stop. And so they haven't stopped. They haven't stopped yet. What makes us think that they're going to stop now? We know that the end is going to end the way it says it's going to. It's just a matter of when does that happen.
And who's involved in bringing it about and why they want to bring it about, which they do.
Sure.
They want that rendezvous with destiny, which, again, most people don't understand. And so, there's two main sort of figures that get written about in a lot of the Qumran documents, and one being the leader of the group, which was obviously a number of different people, and that would be known as the teacher of righteousness. And the teacher of righteousness has a very significant allegorical relationship to their name and their group. But the other one is the evil liar. And certainly from the birth of Jesus to the time of the fall of the Jerusalem temple, and then perhaps as long as the numbers and the persecution was permitting, they looked at the evil liar as Paul.
Really?
The Saul of Tarsus, yes. And so when you hear them talking about the evil liar, that's who they are referencing. And again, they look at what they call Paul's sect was the rogue sect of Christianity, whereas the Essene movement was the mainstream movement of Christianity. And the Paul sect, it took over as, after the Jerusalem church came apart because of the Roman war and the destruction of Jerusalem and the diaspora. And the Paul represents the Gentile church to what the Essenes believe, which are a Judaic group, and took over the church with Gentile doctrines and policies and raised Jesus to a deity status, which they say, which is incorrect because, you can look through the four Gospels, and those were part of the Jerusalem church and the early books of the Acts. But they say that at that time, Jesus wasn't considered to be the Son of God. That only happened with Paul's writing and as they usurped the church. So that's the perspective. But these two groups grew up and were active at the same period of time. And they were rivals for supremacy of this burgeoning religion coming out of the Middle East. And of course, with Constantine, the Essenes were, moved to a dominant position, and that's when all of the Gnostic groups were persecuted into underground activity and to hide themselves, whether it's in the church or in other parts of the world. So moving on to talk a little bit about more who they were, but I just wanted to get some of that stuff out because people will read these references and they won't quite make those connections.
Well, and just real quick, now you said that they believe that Paul was a liar, correct?
Yes.
That is interesting because we're seeing this creep in some areas of the fringe community where there are people who are now there's a guy with a very, very prominent show that has a lot of listeners that says that Paul was a liar, he was a fraud, everything he says is fake and wrong, and so we're seeing a resurgence even in our time of that kind of thinking.
Yeah, they call it Pauline Christianity, and they're going to have to destroy Pauline Christianity to bring about the end times so that they can move Jesus back to prophet status like a Muhammad or like a Zoroaster or like a Buddha or a Hermes and all the other patriarchs of this sort of global Gnostic religion that they're trying to implement. That's the new Babel in the end time.
Okay, well, I guess, yeah, let us know where did this all begin, and how did it just move through time?
Yeah, so they draft Jesus and most of the disciples and all of the Jerusalem church to being Essenes, including James, the brother, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem. Well, actually, the second bishop, but the one who's the real pillar of the early Jerusalem church.
Mm-hmm.
And so who they are is we turn to, let's say, Josephus, who's a very, very good source for the Essenes because he lived at that time, and he was also part of the Essene community. Even though he comes out of the Pharisee sect, he actually went to live with them as he checked out the Sadducees because he wanted to see all the varieties of the religious sects of Judaism. So he tells us that they were part of an ancient group that goes back into prehistory, and that they preserved knowledge from the ancients that we would know. And if anybody has listened to any of my shows, would be that antediluvian knowledge and the knowledge of Egypt.
Yeah. Huh.
And that they were a white robe cult. So white robe is a very significant dress wear that they wore, and as are related groups before them and after them. And that they were also a mystical cult of a secret society complete with initiation. So they were a mystical religion. They were a polytheist religion, as opposed to worshiping God as the supreme God. They would worship him as just one other god of many gods, so the pantheon.
Did they have anything to do with Kabbalah, with the infusion of Kabbalah?
Absolutely, they were. And when you get into writings like Gardner, the Essenes were actually Kabbalists. They're part of that. And a number of other groups that are either over time been misrepresented or taken over, or splinter groups that people might be familiar with. And sticking with Josephus just for a second, he also recorded them as worshiping fallen angels. Oh. And they would not give up the names of these angels that they worshiped even unto death. And again, you can go to the Unger's Bible Dictionary as well, or Nelson's Bible Dictionary, look up Essenes, and it'll basically say the same thing that I'm saying here that Josephus documented. But I like Josephus because he lived at that time, even at the time of the fall of Jerusalem, participated in the war, and then documented all of Jewish history for the Romans so that it wouldn't be lost to history. And they were also very heavily developing in the area of medicine, which again sort of links them back to Heliopolis in a different way. And they were very much an ascetic group and a monastic group. So they were the first ones to set up private places of worship for their polytheist religion, with special temples outside of Jerusalem, and that's why Quran, or the Qumran area, the Dead Sea area, was where they had these special places of worship that was distinctly different that went on in the temple, of course. And that they tend to be celibate, and they also had harsh rules for what they would do for their food. And they actually had a manual of discipline, I think as the name was called, that was this whole list of rules and regulations that they had to live by, including humility, but humility in such large ways that it's almost hubris in its approach. And if this reminds you a lot of the Jesuits, well, it should, because it's a related sort of group, which again comes 1,500 years later, but very much part of the same sort of group.
Well, if these guys had that knowledge, if they brought that knowledge with them through the antediluvian times to our times, you have to imagine that they were probably one of the root groups, right, that spread all these other ideas around.
Exactly. And so when we talk about the Essenes, these were who they looked at as their greatest patriarch was Enoch. But not Enoch, son of Jared of the Sethians, Enoch, son of Cain. And that's their their greatest patriarch, and Moses is the second patriarch, but not in the Moses as we would understand Moses from how we understand how Christianity came out of Judaism. I'll come back to that just in a second, but sticking with Enoch for a second. Of course, Enoch worked with the fallen angels, so direct relationship there, makes perfect sense. And their greatest scripture that they cherished was the Book of Jubilees, written by Enoch, but now, as you understand it, written by Enoch, son of Cain. So when we look at some of these other books coming out of the Qumran area that are talking about Enoch, we have to be very, very careful when they talk about the Book of Giants or the Secrets of Enoch, as opposed to the first book of Enoch, which essentially runs a monotheistic course. But read those books for context, but be very, very careful of them. And the Essenes also cherished the serpent and the dragon and seraphim images, which were the watchers and the fallen angels of prehistory. And moving forward to Moses, their second greatest patriarch, is as they look at what happened with the Sadducees and the Pharisees as actually being the rogue cult. They actually believed that Moses, who was educated at Heliopolis, was a polytheist, and that at some point in time after the Exodus, even though Moses brings the wisdom and the knowledge of Egypt and the sacred sciences, the rogue monotheist religion takes over, moving the polytheist true religion, as they call it, the alleged true religion, as the Essenes call it, off to more of the side, even though they still had Aaronite priests, right? And again, they believe that because they had priests and elders on the Jerusalem Council that descended down from Aaron, they believe that they had the true religion that comes from Heliopolis as well.
So,
and then if you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, do you think that the golden calf incident, was that propagated by the Essenes? Do you believe that they were usurping at that time, trying to take that back, or is that a different group?
No, I think that's just the
Egyptian culture
Israelites
infused.
Who were raised for 400 years under polytheism into a nation, right? And that's the cult of the bull. And I'll touch on the cult of the bull as it deals with the Essenes, but I think that develops later.
Just kind of an infusion of culture, since they were in Israel or in Egypt for so long, they just picked up those customs? Okay.
Yes. And as this polytheist group develops, I mean, and I'll come back to this as well, you now learn why the bull cult of Molech and Baal were so easily accepted by so many, because you have this third rogue group that's going on there, right? Okay, and so they also did not follow the lunar calendar like the monotheists did. They followed the solar calendar because they were sun worshippers. Okay, so these are a completely different group than the monotheist tradition, and so they believe that they have the true religion that goes back to Heliopolis that Aaron and Moses brought back with them. So they draft them as polytheists, right? Okay, so this is very, very important to do, because they'll draft all the major people of Judaism, whether it's David or it's Solomon or it's Jesus or it's James or it's John the Baptist, because that's what they do. And they pull everything into this worldwide Gnostic polytheist religion in a deceptive manner, because, I mean, polytheism and monotheism are at odds with each other, right? It's the fallen angels against the true God. And so some of the other groups that were around at the time of Jesus that these Essenes were part of, that people may have heard of or may not be, but the most deceptive one is Nazarene. And most people look at that word Nazarene as being Jesus of Nazareth. Well, that's not what it means at all. Nazarene is an Essene ideology and an Essene sect. And this is the Nazarenes that then draft Jesus from Nazareth as part of that same sort of rogue group. Not that Jesus was, but they just draft him accordingly. And Nazarene actually comes not from Nazareth; it comes from Nazar, which is Natzar. And what that means is, and without coincidence, because everything in occultism has a meaning to their names and their titles.
Sure.
That you just need to understand what they're talking about. It translates actually as guardians and watchers. Right back to the watchers. And guardians and watchers of this ancient science and knowledge, or the seven sacred sciences, developed and perverted by Enoch the Evil.
So they see themselves as the ones who are overseeing this ancient knowledge that will carry it through the ages, basically.
Yes, as certainly at that point in time, and certainly there's a relationship there as it moves through time. And so, just so that people understand that, if you go back to Masonic history, they also draft Enoch as one of the great patriarchs, and Lamech and Tubal-Cain and Nama, all the descendants of Cain, even though there's some names that are identical on the Sethian line. This is the Cain line that they're talking about. And it's out of this mystical sun-worshipping religion that Enoch develops, right, that becomes this religion of the Nephilim and of Egypt and of the whole Middle East and pretty much the whole polytheist world, because it's the same religion, right?
Yeah.
This is the religion that the Essenes are taking themselves back to. And out of this mystical religion of that time, also Masonic history comes out of, and their secret societies are developed out of this mystical religion. So again, we have this connection to the Essenes, as I said, not only back into prehistory, but all the way through to today.
So they're terribly
still there in the background.
Yeah, they're terribly important when it comes to secret societies, because they basically are the root, like we've talked about. I mean, they really are the ones who set the groundwork for the Masons and all these other groups that would carry forward. And you got, it's like they're basically not putting all their eggs in one basket. They're spreading it all around through all these groups and trickling it through, so that if one gets shut down, there's two or three other ones that can carry the tradition along. And it's actually pretty brilliant if you think about it, on a very diabolical and nefarious way. But
yeah, it is. And I will, as the show progresses a little bit later on, I'll connect who they are and what groups they're part of throughout the last 2,000 years, and their connections and how Freemasonry views them today and part of their history.
Awesome.
And so I'll provide some insights on that. So Nazarene is one of these groups, because there's several sects of these Gnostics that are moving around at the time of Jesus, before and afterwards. And Nazarene is one of the significant ones, as were the Kabbalists, because this is the polytheist group of Essenes. So anything to do with Kabbalism coming out of there, out of Judea of that time, and later is again rooted in this Essene religion, maybe a sister sect, but still part of that overall Essene polytheist religion. And so we also have the Mandaeans, which are also known as Sabians. And Sabians, whether or not you're talking in the Quran or dig them up as more of an ancient religion, they're part of this mix in here that's mixed into Judaism as well. And they're a splinter sect of John the Baptist, because they draft John the Baptist as well as being an Essene. And so now we have the Mandaeans, who are sun worshippers and followers, a rogue sect of John the Baptist, just as the Joanites are. They are also an Essene group that is Gnostic as well, and they're part of this whole sort of group. And then we also have a very interesting character that people might recognize, called Simon the Magus.
Yes.
And he's mentioned in the Bible for particular reasons, because he not only is trying to buy in the Bible the Holy Spirit from Peter, and trying to bring in Christianity under that one religion to control that and the power of the Holy Spirit. He's also considered an Antichrist figure. But he's also, in this tradition, the successor to John the Baptist. And he is educated in Alexandria and is initiated into the mysteries with the Basilidians, which is a significant group that comes together again with Freemasonry a little bit later as being sort of the basis of the philosophy for Freemasonry, and then part of another group that reforms, hundreds and hundreds of years later. Did you have a question there, Brandon?
No, I'm actually messing with the audio here.
Okay.
Something got messed up.
I just thought you might be trying to get in there, and I was carrying on a little bit too much. So.
No, you're actually doing me a favor. I'm trying to get you dialed in where we need to be. And I'm just, whenever you're on, Gary, I am just sitting here listening and soaking up what you're saying because I learn a lot. And you do a really good job of bringing all these, all the topics that you're talking about and laying them out, and then at the end it all comes together. And so I'm just, I'm kind of in awe at how these groups have just maintained through time. I mean, yes, Christianity, we obviously we maintain through time, but they've done it side by side with us in much of the same way. I mean, look at all the denominations we split off into, and they've really done the same thing. They've split off into all these different denominations of the same Gnostic ideology, and so it's just fascinating to me how all this works, and kind of scary at the same time because they're everywhere. But
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and as we mix in one more group of this polytheist area coming out, and again, they have documents as well, and it's a Essene document, so people need to understand it. It's called the Covenanters of Damascus, and so there's a very interesting sort of scripture that's out there. It's called the Document of Damascus, and it talks about giants and things like that. But understand, read it for context, but understand it's a polytheist doctrine. Okay, so all of these were all part of the Essene sort of rogue group that people don't seem to recognize were a very, very important group of Judaism at the time.
No,
and we don't even in the Bible get a lot of references to them, right?
Honestly, before we even did this show, I had not honestly really heard anything about them, Gary. I've heard about all these other groups that have spawned off of this group, but I'd never really, the name was somewhat familiar, probably because a couple biblical passages, but I knew nothing about the group, and so that's why I was looking forward to tonight's show.
So if you want to read, and again, you have to read it with understanding who they are, what they did, what they believed in.
What they believe, yeah.
So the first reference is in Ezekiel, if you want to believe that. So that shows you how old this is, and this is the time of the second temple, or is it the first temple? No, it's the first temple because they're going to be dispersed. I might have that backwards, but anyways, at the time of Ezekiel, so. Before the time of Jesus, 500, 600, 700 years. So in Ezekiel 8, it talks about the idolatry that's going on in the worshiping of the temple. And so, this is the destruction of the first temple just before there, and that'll be done by the Babylonians. So they give everybody a frame of reference, and he talks about the most horrible things that are going on. They're detestable, almost abominations going on. What he's talking about are, first thing is going to, not only are the elders worshiping idols and doing horrible things in private, which again is probably the Essenes, but now he connects it that it's exactly who they're talking about. And even though there may have been Pharisees and Sadducees doing the same, this is the Essene worship, right? And he talks about the women in the temple mourning for Tammuz. Tammuz is the god of Mesopotamia, right? And is like Osiris or Baal. It's the equivalent, right? So they're mourning for Tammuz at the temple, and then he walks into the inner temple, and he's taken in there, and there's 25 men worshiping the sun facing the east, and their backs to the temple. These are the Essenes that they're talking about. So people think that they're just a group that might have been around just at the time of Jesus. They go back into prehistory. And if you believe what they believe, that all the way back to Solomon and all the way back to Moses, and then always obviously somehow connected back to the Enochian mysticism developed in the antediluvian epoch. Now, in the New Testament, the first time you might get a hint of them, and I know a lot of people say this is a direct reference, this is possible or not, but I'll raise it because a lot of people like to think it comes from a questioning aspect, even though it's raised by the Pharisees, about probably this rogue sect. So in Matthew 19:11, it talks about Jesus being questioned about marriage and divorce. And Jesus goes on talking about celibacy and non-celibacy. And, of course, it's the celibacy aspect that was only done at the Essene cult, not necessarily in the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So probably a reference to there, and that they didn't marry, and they had very, very strict diets, and they were ascetics, is what I talked about. But if we get further into the New Testament, in First Timothy, we get a very interesting reference, which is, to me, can only be the Essenes, and that's First Timothy 1, I think verse 3, and it talks about warning of people of not to pay attention and go with the doctrines of certain men who teach false doctrines and devote themselves to endless genealogies, and that they promote themselves to controversies and the doctrines of humans rather than God's work, which is done through faith. So what's key here is the seven sciences promoting controversies and a pantheon of gods and endless genealogies, and as my book says over and over and over, genealogies are tracked all the way from Nephilim and fallen angels right through to the end time and connected to the Antichrist. So these endless genealogies is just a key thing that can only be the Essenes that are being talked about, because they're part of this belief system and organization.
And see, that never really made a whole lot of sense to me before either. It's like, what's the big deal if they're looking back at their past? But I'm thinking back to all our interviews and what I've read in your book, and just the fact that the elite are always tracking themselves back and trying to maintain their bloodlines, and they're constantly working on their genealogy, making sure that everything is the way it should be. So it's kind of cool how when you have to be careful, I know, but when you look at what the other side believes and then you read the Bible in the context of what was happening at the time and what the belief systems were going on, it really makes a lot more sense when you can put the whole framework together, It's just pretty interesting.
And Masons, because they use the Bible as well, they use the base Bible, and they actually in their writings say that they actually were the main proponents of getting the King James Bible written. But that's a different rabbit hole to go down, and that they have an extended Bible. So when they get to that verse that I quoted in Timothy, is they don't translate that as doctrines, as false doctrines. They translate that as quote unquote, and Pike actually calls it false gnosis, that there are accurate teaching of gnosis and inaccurate. So they manipulate that. And gnosis, of course, is the root for Gnostic religions, which is what the Essenes were part of, right? And gnosis is the word for knowledge. That's where it comes from, right? To arrive at that. So when they look at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that knowledge is what they really focus on there. That's the tree of gnosis as they understand it in the Gnostic religion, tree of knowledge. Right? And then also, just so that people understand that I'm not making this up, that there is some biblical evidence to go along with this, go to Colossians 2 in verse 8, 16, and 20, because it can only be talking about the Essenes. And in verse 8, it talks about not being taken captive by deceptive and hollow philosophy. Right? Philosophy comes out of the seven sacred sciences. It's absolutely key. Just as philosophy is a key part of the Jesuits, it's part of the same group, because they studied the seven sacred sciences and promoted as well. And this philosophy that depends again on human traditions and principles of this world. Again, that's the sciences and Gnosticism. And then in verse 16, it moves on to talk about don't let people judge you and deceive you on what you can eat and what you can drink, on the false humility that's overdone, again, very much similar to Jesus, or the worship of angels, right? This is key core stuff. And in verse 20, it instructs not to submit to their false rules of this world. And again, what's part of any religion that goes wrong, typically polytheism, they have human-made doctrine. But when it creeps into monotheism, whether it was the Targum in Judaism at that time, or man-made doctrine that creeps into the Catholicism that comes along later, this is the same type of ideology because it's the same sort of deception. And I'm not saying that all Catholicism is wrong. Just it's this virus from this polytheism that has human doctrines being superimposed over God's doctrine,
Sure.
which you have to be very, very careful of. And so typically those come from the oral traditions, right? And that these rules have an appearance of wisdom or holiness, right? But they're really hollow underneath because it doesn't come from God. It comes from humans. It's human doctrine, right? And it's this self-imposed rules of self-imposed worship, as opposed to worshiping in a manner that's in the Spirit of God and by the laws of God.
Boy, do we have some of that nowadays, huh?
Do we ever? Yeah. And the harsh treatment of the body. So, again, you get that image of the Jesuits whipping themselves back and forth, of that false sense of humility. And these Essenes did this as well. And that they tend to also, and I think this goes maybe to their rituals of sexual nature, of where they have an indulgence of, sensual indulgence, overindulgence. So I think when we link all of that together, they can only be talking about the Essenes, because it's this polytheism that can only come from the Essene groups and the Kabbalists of that time.
Yeah, that's it's always interesting to hear more about how it all ties together. A lot of what Dr. Heiser does too. I don't know if you've listened or read any of his work, but it's always interesting because he's always talking about how we need to look at everything in the Bible in the proper context of the time and everything else, and it makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting how you parallel that to now, and it all still applies because the same thing is happening, the same man-made ideas. And so you really got to wonder, how much infiltration have we really had into mainstream Christianity?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it has. I mean, anytime you have allegorical interpretation or anything that's being talked about the inaccuracy of the Bible, then you have, that is the Gnostic virus that has come into Christianity. I mean, you can see obvious iconology that goes sideways, but it's easy to get people to believe that not everything in the Bible is true, which is a common statement these days, and that you have to interpret so many things allegorically. And everything that is in Freemasonry or polytheism or the Essene cult and religion, everything is interpreted allegorically, and you have to be initiated into the mysteries to understand what the true meaning is. Right?
Yeah.
So anytime you hear that, then of an allegorical interpretation, understand that's the Gnostics getting inside of Christianity to bring it down and redefine it for the end time. Because they have to bring Jesus back to deity status. And in that sort of understanding, they really like to say something that most people don't pick up on, where they talk about Jonah and being taken into the belly of the fish for 3 days and down into the abyss of the earth, and then somehow being spit out and surviving. They say, well, there's no way that can be true, right? And so that's just an allegorical story. And most people will nod their heads, well, maybe it is, and then, maybe it's just a lesson that's in there. But it's not, because our Messiah, our Redeemer, says the only sign to the wicked generation that he visited would be the sign of Jonah.
Yeah.
So if that's allegorical, then his resurrection is allegorical.
Yeah, well, just the very notion that God can't keep a man alive inside a whale is ridiculous. If you don't believe that your God can keep a man alive inside a whale, then what's the point of even believing in God in the first place? I mean, if he has no power, why are you even wasting your time? I mean, really, so let's look at it.
In the church, where you have people arguing from a human capability or a human doctrine or a human tradition,
yes,
that's polytheism, right? And they override that from an understanding and what we can do to what God can do, which is, an abomination in the statement. So, God can do anything. He can.
Yeah.
So why would that be impossible for him to do?
Wow, that's that's quite an indictment, man. I mean, if you think about it, I think Christians have to really think about that. I mean, why are we putting limits on God? Why are we thinking that he has to conform to our thoughts and our ideas? But that's very much the way that Christianity has gone in modern times. Yep. Wow, that really gives you something to think about. It's huh.
I'm getting a little bit of echo. I don't know whether you're picking it up on your end.
I can fix that for you. There you go. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's gone now. I just don't want it echoing on the.
It's very, very
record,
touchy.
So.
All I have to do is move something just a little bit, and it changes everything. So,
yeah.
Well, Gary, we've got about.
No, I've still got a bit of an echo. Sorry.
Oh, do you? Okay, we'll fix that. And there we go. Let's see if that will fix it. Only when you're talking.
Yeah, only when I'm talking.
Is that better?
That's
okay.
Good.
We've got about. Let's take about 10, 15 more minutes. Go ahead and just kind of bring it all home. Before that, though, can you give everybody kind of a rundown of the books out of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they really need to be careful with? Because I know a lot of people like to dive in, but you're right. There is a lot of stuff in there that you really have to be prayed up and make sure that you're treating with kid gloves. Is that correct?
Yep. All of them.
Okay. Well, that's easy. Okay.
All of them.
Good.
Because whether or not it's the Gospel of Judas or Enochian books or any of the other ones coming out, it is all polytheist based in its writing. So, fine, read them, get a better idea, but make sure you put it into context that it's polytheism. And there's going to be leading you astray in certain areas. So wherever it strays from what the Bible says, that's when you know that you need to get the red flags up.
So you better have your Bible next to you while you're going through this and double checking. Okay.
Yeah. So now the Essenes, as we approach after Jesus is crucified and is raised to heaven, and as we approach 70 AD during the rebellion, the Essenes are the only ones that are left as part of the priests in the temple at its destruction. Okay, they're in control of the church or the temple at that time.
And is that why all this nasty stuff is going on in the temple? I mean, you had prostitution, you had just all this deplorable thing. Detestable is what God called it.
Yeah, I think that was a combination of all of the three sects that were doing that, and that was going on at the time of Jesus. And so this is more or less in the last, say, 4 or 5 years that everybody is fleeing Jerusalem because the armies come there and they're wiping the Judeans out and they're dispersing them to the rest of the world, and they're going to completely destroy Jerusalem, just as Jesus said that they would. And so they hide documents and treasures, and they're the ones who knew where all of these treasures were hidden. And so when we get down to the Templars down the road, they knew where to dig. Okay? And I'll connect that in a few minutes. And so after the fall of Jerusalem, the Essenes, they flee for the most part to Spain and to southern France and all throughout Europe, but mostly in the area of southwest France and northwest Spain do they settle into. And they start and they become the princes of Europe, the nobility, the noble families and running kingdoms. And they take on a title called not only the Essenes, they sort of morph into European families of a very important name, but they're also like to call themselves Rex Du, or the kings of God. They like to call themselves the princes of Jerusalem. And they're also known as the sons of Zadok, which I will come back to as I loop around. I'm going to need more than 10 minutes here, so we're going to run a little bit longer.
Oh, that's fine, Garrett. Yeah, take your time. We're fine.
Okay. And so in Europe, they're developing into these royal families and very powerful families and very rich families, and again, tracking their genealogies. And also, As I said, they drafted the family of Jesus that they call the Despacini, and these are the family of Jesus, not Jesus' descendants in reality, but the family, although they do believe that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had children, and is part of the Despacini.
Sure.
That's their belief system, not mine. And so when Christianity converges with Constantine, and Constantine makes it the religion of the empire, yes, and homogenizes it with the polytheism that everybody knows is in there. There is a new group that's formed as celebration of this, and this is the Order of Constantine and the Order of the Red Cross. And this is an order that I'm going to come back to as I wrap this up, that goes back into the Essenes and back to the two temples. But they're reformed, called the Order of the Red Cross. Now, as we move forward, I'm going to jump, say, 700 years to 1090. There's an interesting fellow that comes along, and his name is Godfrey de Bouillon. And if that name is not familiar to most people, he is one of the founders of the Knights Templar.
Okay.
And he is a descendant of Dagobert. And Dagobert is a Merovingian king, last survivor. The Merovingian king has, as we covered off in the King Arthur interview that we did, not only the bloodlines of David, but the bloodlines of King Saul, the bloodlines of Nephilim, and they also believe that the bloodlines of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, that descends through the son of Mary Magdalene and Jesus, which is named Josephus, and that crosses over from the Camelot dynasties with Aragon to Amenabad into the Merovingian bloodline. Okay, so that's why I had to bring up that other sort of apostasy a little bit earlier about them believing Jesus didn't die on the cross, and why they believe he was a prophet but not Son of God. Right? So he believes that he's a descendant of these people, and he meets with, in 1090, Calabrian monks in Italy, and Calabrian monks are running a Pythagoras mystery school, but under the veil of the Catholic religion. They're just developing the liberal arts, but they're really a Pythagorean mystery school. And what happens is de Bouillon meets with them in 1090, and they agree to go to Jerusalem to do excavation in Jerusalem and to start a new order. Okay. Now, these royal families that come out of Europe, they send representatives of this order. So these are not 9, and in 1118 there's 2 more that are added. Not 9 poor monks. These are 9 kings or princes of not only French nobility and some perhaps even into northern France, and perhaps even bloodlines that go into the Norse, but mostly French. And certainly from that generation from the French, right? And so they are sent there, and these are princes that have been initiated and are the highest adepts of an ancient Masonic organization. So they're going to meet up in Jerusalem with the Calabrian monks, and they're going to form together with this ancient Masonic organization to the other organizations, again, of Joanites, of the Ormus and Alexandrians and the Basilidians of Alexandria, and the Order of Constantine. And the Calabrian monks that go with them, they actually will build with de Bouillon an abbey called the Notre Dame Abbey of de Sion, or how would I pronounce it? Our Lady of Sion. They build a temple there that they do the initiation and create this new order. And this new order, called the Templars, is going to hide this other order underneath, and the amalgamation of this coming together of this new order, and they dedicate it to the Order of the Red Cross of Constantine, and they also take on the names of the princes of Jerusalem, and this is the same people of Rextu. This is the same princes of Jerusalem that come out of the Essenes, because the Essenes believe that they have the royal priests and the royal bloodlines of David and Solomon. Okay, this all comes together to create this Order of Sion and the Priory of Sion at the Abbey of Sion. Okay, and if people don't know what Sion means, it is. I'm just going to bring out my notes here on Sion. Sion is, or Sion as the French would pronounce it, or if it's Sion or Sion in Spain, it comes from Latin for Zion. Okay, so when we talk about the Order of Sion, or the Priory of Sion, it's the Order of Zion. It's this organization that is formed in 1090 and 1099, initiated, and also the same organization that splits away from Templars in 1188 at the cutting of the elm, because the Templars have lost the original goals and they become too focused on banking and growing rich. So they split away. And that's why, even though they discredit the Priory of Sion, those Grand Masters only go back to 1188 at the splitting of the elm at Geezers, because that's when they split. And so if you want to know the Grand Masters before 1188, you go back to the Grand Masters of the Knights Templar, because it's the same organization. Okay, so Sion, what does that mean? Well, Sion is this rock ridge and natural protection at Jerusalem that we first encounter with David as he's trying to invade the city of Jerusalem and take it back from the Jebusites. And so that is still there today, and that was called the Rock of Zion. And that's where this temple was built. And, of course, that was destroyed in about 1200, but on the Rock of Zion. When Zion later becomes known as the whole city of Jerusalem, and then later, it's known as, the millennial city and then the heavenly city as it rolls out through the Bible. But understand what Zion is, because that is so very, very important. Now, they overlay Zion with an allegory, just as in the Holy Grail, where it can mean two different things, and we're talking about Sangreal, Sangreal, Sangreal. They do this again with Zion, only this is Sion or Sion, S-C-I-O-N. And this is, as we know it in its normal translation, an agricultural grafting or shoot cut specifically for grafting, and in this case, allegorically, bloodline. And the second meaning to it is a descendant of a noble, in this case, Nephilim family, and generally the first generation and the firstborn of that descendant, and or a twig of unknown or hidden origin or bloodline, right? So this becomes a code word for Zion, and that's why you hear of Zionists in good ways and bad ways. Conspiracy theories and otherwise, or the ultimate with the elders of Zion, because this is all part of that entire meaning. Okay? And understand that the Priory of Sion, priory is just another word for church or monastery, and also understand that the Essenes were part of this group that comes together in 1099, and they were the first monastic groups. And then all the other groups that mold into Catholicism, whether it's the Benedictine monks or the Calabrian monks or the Augustine monks or the Chaldean monks or the Cistercians, these are all part of the same group that is operating to form the Knights Templar. And then Saint Bernard comes along, and he writes the letter that is going to ensure the Papal Bull of 1128, okay? That the Templars are going to have all of this power, and they grow to this huge organization. But there's something that happens that's very important in 1118, because in 1099, even though Godfrey de Bouillon is offered the Prince of Jerusalem, or the King of Jerusalem title there, because of his Benjamite bloodline that's grafted in the Sion, he turns it down and only accepts the title of the Duke of the Holy Sepulchre. But in 1118, Baldwin, who is Godfrey's brother, accepts it as the first King of Jerusalem. And then the next one is the Count of Anjou, which is, of course, the Anjou is part of this bloodlines of royal families in France that we're talking about. Okay, and the King of Jerusalem is going to be the title that the Antichrist accepts at the abomination in the temple, right, as his blood inheritance coming through these same bloodlines. And St. Bernard, who is the second most powerful person in Roman Catholicism at the time, and nothing is decided until he weighs in, he makes this happen as taking them from the small order to being multinational like a corporation. Well, who St. Bernard is he comes out of the Montbard family, again, out of France. So he's not this poor monk. And guess who is one of the original Knights Templar, one of these princes of Jerusalem, which is a title they also take in 1118. They fully accept this Princes of Jerusalem title at the initiation of King Baldwin. Is Andre Montbard is one of those knights, and he is the uncle to St. Bernard. Okay, so this is totally connected. You know, some of the other names that come out of there are the Count of Champagne, who they were big donors of the Cistercians, and where St. Bernard comes out of that order. And some other names are Henry St. Clair, who's part of the additional two in 1118. And Henry St. Clair is part of the St. Clair family that is part of the Grand Masters of Sicily and the Prior of Sion, and also the family that starts up the modern version of Freemasonry after the fall of the Templars in 1307 in Scotland, right? And is considered the first Grand Master of that group and the founder of modern Freemasonry. You also have people like the Folk of Anjou, which is why Anjou becomes the second King of Jerusalem title. You got two of them that are Rosal and Gondomir. They're Cistercian monks, so again, Gnostics. You can understand very quickly here that this was a close-knit group of people that were rich and from the same religion and were not working for the good of Christianity.
And so when the Templars split, they basically went into banking. Are they the ones who basically are the mega bankers of the world, the big families now?
Yeah, they needed to rebuild that because the Templars were the modern banking arm, right? So after the fall of the Templars, you have several organizations that have to rise up. You've got the formations of the Rosicrucians, or the Rose Croix, as they're known, at the splitting of the Elms coming out. And they form very quickly to start creating some of these other groups and splitting them up because they don't want it all centralized in the Templars anymore.
Sure.
Because they were overthrown all at once. So you have the Rosicrucians being set up first, and then you have other groups like the Freemasons being set up to deal with politics and the military, and then later the media. You have the Jesuits, which are going to replace the Templars inside of the Roman Church, and that's why you see them out in front on the exploration of the New World and controlling and manipulating doctrines. And you have the creation of the Royal Society to take control of education and to take control of the developing the seven sciences, to lead people away from God and to honor the fallen pantheon and to build monuments to them and to discredit God for everything, just like they've done all the way through history.
Sure.
And that's created by Rosicrucians and Freemasons. And coming to your point, they also have to recreate the banking arm, which is the Bauer family in the 1700s, who changed their names to the Rothschilds.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Okay.
When they set up the London Bank.
Huh.
So yeah, so you can see how this all connects. And then if you take that sort of forward to modern Freemasonry and talk in getting into the Masonic connections, is that I'm going to use some things that come out of Robert Lomas and Albert Mackey and Albert Pike.
So their own writings, their own words.
Their own writings,
yep.
Yeah. Okay, so they have similarities, the Essenes and their organization, to the Freemasons. Just to quickly sort of cover a quick of them off. You know, you have to be chosen to join the Essene order at the time, just like secret societies. You had to swear an oath. It's an initiatory order. You have to go through various degrees of knowledge. They had secret handshakes to recognize each other. And they both were heavily connected to operative masonry or building things, right? Just as the Freemasons came out of the operative building guilds out of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, Masonic students, they have to learn about the Essenes, right? And their Masonic beginnings, because again, as we talked about with the formation of the Templars, this was combining with the Essenes, this ancient Masonic order, which also had the knowledge come down through Moses and in their belief system, and Solomon, and down to the Essenes. Okay, so how they connect themselves back, other than that, and how it comes together, and also understand that the Gnostics that I was talking about had molded themselves in the Roman Church. It was the Cistercians, the Augustines, the Chaldeans, and the Benedictines that built all of the churches, whether it's in the Roman Collegia first, where the Manichaeans and the ones in Italy first went to, or later on with in England with Augustine, or later on with the Gothic art coming back from Jerusalem and the knowledge that they found from the Templars with St. Bernard, and then the Mason and Templar building guilds that built all the great Gothic temples of Europe from that knowledge. Okay, this building aspect is significant to it, just as the Essenes take themselves back to the two buildings of the temple as part of this organization, both the first temple and the second temple. And the first temple, what happens is this knowledge to build Solomon's temple comes from Tyre, from the king of Tyre, from the Dionysian builders, right? And this is also building knowledge that goes down through the Pythagorean mystery schools that ends up in Roman in about 700 BC, and the formation of the Roman Collegia that the Gnostics mold themselves into in the early first few centuries of the modern era, of the Common Era. And so they have to import this knowledge that Solomon goes to the king of Tyre with, and they set up these Masonic building guilds, which the Essenes inherit this knowledge from the first temple. And then they reform these other Mason building guilds, these Knight Mason building guilds, the Essenes, as they're also called, to build with Jerubbaal the second temple. And they also believe, and this is also in Masonic writings, and everything I'm talking about comes from Masonic writings, that Jerubbaal was initiated by Darius into the Knight Order of the East and the West. That is also part of the Essene groups that joined several of these other groups that I just named, whether it's Knights of the Temple, East and West from Darius and Jerubbaal, the Assyrians, the Knight Masons order, or the Royal Ark Masons. There's a lot of different names to these orders that came together to build the second temple.
Yeah. I mean,
right?
Really, this may be oversimplifying, but what we're really talking about here is the entire shadow government of the world. I mean, what we're talking about is our modern day shadow government, where they started. I mean, they started with this group, the Essenes, and I'm sure others, but they now have overtaken basically the entire world, if you want to look at it in a certain light.
Yeah, so if you see you see that conglomeration of the Priory of Sion and the Knights Templar and the Order of Sion and all these other different names that they had. And then there's a splitting away in 1188 of this group away from the Templars that later get destroyed in 1307. You have the formation of the Rosicrucians coming out. And this is purebloods that the original formation has 66 founders of, which is an interesting number, but they start to set up all of these other groups. But these are purebloods, right? Now, you have, as they create these other initiatory groups, they have talented and lower diluted bloodlines rising up through Freemasonry to a depth level to the Rosicrucians, to the Illuminati, and then up to the Rosicrucians. But over half of the Rosicrucians are purebloods that now move up and answer to the Council of 300, who answer to the Council of 33, who answer to the 13 families. And who the Rosicrucians also answer to is called the Invisible Ones, as in their Invisible College, which is the alternative name for the Royal Society. But the Invisible Ones are also known as the Hidden World Government in their belief system.
It's just insane how layered they are and how smart they are about the way they do things. I mean, they have groups upon groups upon groups upon groups. So, I mean, you essentially have to really, really dig to get any dirt, and when you do find dirt on one, go ahead and shut them down because there's 10 more over here that are doing the same thing,
Yeah. And so when we talked about this going back to Heliopolis and Moses as they draft everybody in the Bible that you can think of, Egypt was the second pillar of the religion coming out of the dispersion of Babel, and the seven sacred sciences and mysticism being respawned at that point in time. So Chaldea and the Magi, where Nimrod goes, is the second sort of pillar, right? And of course, in Masonic history, Nimrod is the first Grand Master of Freemasonry of the post-Diluvian epoch, and Babel is their first manifestation of these buildings, along with the Tower of Babel, just as pyramids would be what the Freemasons credit Enoch for building in the antediluvian epoch. Mm-hmm. And what's important about this is that he is the religion of Babel or Babylon, which is the religion of the end time, right?
Yeah.
Right? So you see how all of this just sort of weaves itself together. And so when we look at other orders that are in Masonry and in Gnosticism, we have the order of Melchizedek. And everybody's going to take a step back and go, whoa. I mean, this is the priest that, blessed Abraham. This is the priest that this is the group and priest order in the Bible that, is talked about hand in hand with David and Jesus being part of. But you have to understand there's two different orders of Melchizedek. There is the pure order that includes Jesus, Abraham, and David, as the Bible talks about. And then there's the Canaanite order. That goes back to Baal and Molech and bull worship that we were talking about earlier. So let me just connect this final part of it, because they also draft this order of Canaan and overlay that with the Jewish tradition, and again, expect the Antichrist to pull in this order of Melchizedek as part of his pedigree along with his bloodlines, okay? As well as being the king of Jerusalem. And so this order of Zedek is a Canaanite sun god, okay, of light and righteousness. So when you talk about light, understand Freemasons are the children of light, just as the Essenes are the sons of light, the sons of Zedek, okay, the sons of righteousness, okay? And Melchi is, and Zedek was also the rebellious god of God's counsel. So you know who this is going back to.
Yeah. And right? I mean, don't they always refer to Lucifer as the light bringer? Or the
yes.
Yeah, so I mean it's pretty. Yes. And then all of these,
and he masquerades as an angel of light.
Sure, all these polytheistic religions always, the main god is the sun god. They're always worshiping the sun. The sun is Lucifer. It's pretty clear cut and easily seen when you figure it out.
Yeah. Now they pervert the first part of Melchizedek into Melchi or Molech. Right?
Okay.
Malach, Molech, Melchi, and that stands for king. Okay? And there's several different variations of this as we see Malach show up in the Bible, and it's all talking about the god Molech. So he's called Malach, Milcom, Molech, Milcom, Melcom, Chemosh, which is the Moabite version of it. This is, again, the perversion side of this order. And what's interesting is king or prince, and whereof Jerusalem, or the sons of Zadok, are the sons of righteousness and the princes of Jerusalem. This is the Essene order that ends up in the Masonic order and rituals.
Huh.
That is absolutely no coincidences. And Molech is the son of Baal, who's the son of El, and El is also a morbid, lustful, fallen angel or watcher, as they go back into their pantheon. And this is the same cult of the bull that comes out of Egypt, whether it's the Apis bull cult, which is the calf, or it's the traditional bull cult, because they have two different sort of parts of that bull cult in Egypt. And when you talk about gospels coming out of Qumran, you have out of the Nag Hammadi library, you have the Sethian sect of Gospels, and in there, and that's Amakaseth, which who they thought was another Nephilim in their belief system, and has the spark of the divine or the spark of Seth intermitted in their descendants. So again, understand the allegory that's going in here right throughout. They have a couple of Gospels of the order of Melchizedek, or however you want to pronounce it. I like to go Melchi, as in taking it right back to Molech, but I know most people like to pronounce that as Melchizedek. But understand that they have Gospels of this that they teach within Gnosticism, right? And again, this is why how and why, not only as descendants of David, not only as descendants of Jesus, not only as descendants of Solomon, that they're going to draft as part of their pedigree this order for the Antichrist, as well as the King of Jerusalem, which is the King Saul inheritance and Benjamite inheritance of Jerusalem. So there's a lot more that you could go into in a lot of detail about who the Essenes are, but I think what I've been able to do is connect them from the beginning to the end and a whole bunch of information in between. And as it's so important today to be very, very careful of any Qumran documents, because it's essentially polytheism.
Well, let me ask you about the documents that they found there, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It seems like these guys are really on the ball. They really know what's going on. They know where they've put everything. What are the chances that was a coincidence? I mean, do you really think that some shepherd boy threw a rock in a cave and found these, or do you think that this was set up?
They knew it was there. That's just misdirection. But they have to create a story. They have to bring the world along in a manner that doesn't overwhelm them, right? Until they're ready. And they purposely hid them, just as they purposely hid things under the temple. That includes in their belief system the genealogy of Jesus that they brought out of Jerusalem, which is part of the deception that they're going to bring in the end time, because they're obviously forged documents. But yeah, they knew where to go look, not only in the temple, but they knew where, because they had lots of time to prepare, because, I mean, this is a difficult area to get to, right?
Sure,
so they were able to hide them, and at that right time, which again, coincidentally comes after the creation of Israel, as we start to move into the end time, so that they can start moving the agenda forward. This is a connection in terms of timing of the discovery, and then how they roll that information out. As we get more and more and more of it, which we are, that just shows us that we're getting closer to the end time.
Well, and it's interesting that they're actually about to allow, or they are going to go back and do another expedition at Qumran. It's actually a group of Christians wanting to do it. And it's interesting because it makes you wonder, if they do have this much control over all this, are they going to find something that's hidden there, or are they just going to, or is it just something they're going to go and probably not find anything? It's interesting to think about, because I've always wondered how a shepherd boy just out of nowhere finds these jars. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, and these are things that changed the views of a lot of believers. I mean, some for the good. I mean, the Book of Enoch gave us a lot of information and things like that, but a lot of people take it too far and they go too deep, and then they go over to the Gnostic side of things. So it is interesting.
Yeah, and even though I like the first book of Enoch, because it does run fairly parallel, I mean, understand, though, the first copy of that comes about is found and translated by a descendant of Robert the Bruce. His name is Alexander the Bruce, and he's a Freemason, and he's a Gnostic. So what did he corrupt?
Yeah, you got to wonder.
Know, right?
Yeah.
Right? So even though, that's why, just be careful. And I like that book. And one of the corruptions, or one of the markers, just might show up in chapter 60 of the first book of Enoch, where it says Enoch at that time is 550 years old. Well, that's not correct, because we know Enoch, son of Jared, was taken to heaven at 365 years of age. So is this them? And again, there's not too much corruption that I can see in the book of Enoch. I think they're just overlaying that book with their own Enoch.
Sure, and I think you're probably right. I mean, even in the Bible, Enoch is referenced. The book of Enoch is referenced. So you have to think that that text probably did exist back then. But you're right. How much did they corrupt it? If you have a Freemason who's translating this thing and giving it to the world, you got to be a little leery. And I think your approach is right. Be very, very careful with anything that's not canon, because you just don't know, but it is all very fascinating to read, and it is easy to get sucked in because it's a lot of interesting information, but some of it's not good information. It's just these groups amaze me at really how well they've kept this all together for so long, and you can see that really their purpose is to maintain this knowledge, the gnosis through time, and then to preserve this bloodline that will ultimately bring about the Antichrist. And, you have to look at technology and think we're getting close. They're getting very close to where, if they wanted to, if we're talking, I mean, do you think the Antichrist is gonna be a hybrid that's created, or do you think this is just through breeding that the shell of the Antichrist is going to be made that the enemy will inhabit?
Well, we'll have to actually see how that comes about, but I think that God permits these groups to bring on the end time, and they do want to bring on this rendezvous with destiny, and they keep 3 well-initiated Antichrist figures ready to go at all the time and hidden.
Sure.
And they're purebloods. And so, yes, they want to present the Antichrist at any time. The only thing that prevents them from moving forward, not that they're not ready, it's because of the restrainer.
Yeah, God has to pull that back. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as soon as that happens, they'll move very, very quickly.
Well,
and they've been trying to do it at any time other than the ordained time, but they will accept the ordained time.
And that, that has to do with us. Are we going to turn to God and do what we're supposed to, or are we not? That's why we have free will. Free will is given to us to decide basically when the end is going to come. If we turn completely away, he's going to pull the restrainer. It's going to happen. And it really makes me wonder with this recent election and things happening. I believe right now we are at one of those points in history when 100 years from now, if we even have that long, they're either going to look back and they're going to say, wow, this is the time that the world or in America for sure either turned to God and we had amazing revival, or this is where they really blew it and it all went down the toilet,
And I think this is very much a turning point. And again, I don't put dates, and I'm not a prophet, but I think we're starting in a direction to bring this time on. Not only with this election at this intersection and the repercussions, whatever those might be, that will help accelerate things, but just other things coming together. So when you look at 1967 or 1947 and add a generation to that, and I'm talking about the birth of Israel and the birth of and the taking of Jerusalem in 67, you have a window if you use 7 years as a generation, which I know you can't technically do, but we know the generation of the fig tree, we have to pick a number for a generation. So it's a little more or a little bit less, but probably a little bit more, if anything. Then it's either you open up a window from 2017 to 2037 for the end times.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you look at the prophecy of Jubilees coming out of, again, you have to be careful of the source, but Judaism, where you have 10 Jubilees, and we are now entering in the last Jubilees, which is finishing the last Jubilees in 1917, starts the end time. That sort of brings that sort of belief system. And if people don't know the prophecy of Jubilees, it basically, it was made in the 12th century, and it begins with the Ottoman Empire in 1617, and then their reign ends in 1917 in World War I, which is, basically 400 years or 8 Jubilees. And then you have one Jubilee where the land remains desolate, which takes us to 1967. And then you have the last Jubilee, until the end time begins. So that's the Jubilee prophecy. And then you have the Catholic prophecy of Malachi, with Francis being the last pope and the anti-pope and the black pope, which all makes sense from a Jesuit, preparing the way for the false prophet and bringing down Roman Catholicism and changing the doctrine. And you see things shaping up that this window might be the window. But again, anybody who has tried to predict the time of the end time has been wrong. So I want to be very careful of that. But I do think this is a significant period we're about to enter into.
Well, the Bible's very clear that no man is ever going to know the time,
Yes.
But these are very, very interesting times. I mean, I agree.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe as a country we've gone way too far over the edge, Maybe the guy that we all think is going to be the one who helps us bring it in the right direction is actually the opposite,
Well,
I don't know.
You have, and I think, no matter what, whoever would have won the election, I think it would move it in the direction of, bringing on world government and the world religion. But, we have to understand that we're going to have these very powerful oligarchs rise up, and we're going to have these kings that are over these groups of nations, and so you have to have these almost larger than normal personalities, and you start to see it. You see what, the premier of China is trying to do to extend and consolidate power and his length of time. You've got Putin that's basically usurped. You wonder whether Trump becomes something like that and becomes, part of the Western sort of representative. But there are going to be people like these kinds of people that are going to be representatives of the 10 groups of nations that form the world government.
Well, yeah, you have Erdogan in Turkey who, he has people left and right telling him that he's the Mahdi, and he believes it. And he's positioning himself for that. And I can easily see, where if evangelicals especially do not hold Trump to what he says he's going to do, and they just sit back and go, oh, life's great, we got our guy in, let's just back him 100%. Wow, that's a big. You don't ever back a politician 100%. You for one, our faith is not in man; it's in God. If you're putting your faith in man, you're already in the wrong place. If we don't put our faith in God and realize that He is the one we turn to fix things, if we don't get our souls right, our lives right, our families right, it's not going to matter who's in place. And to blindly put our faith in a man is a scary proposition.
Exactly. So anyways, I think we're in interesting times, and I'm not predicting the end of the world right, like in the next 7 years, or definitely not in the last 7 years. But I think we're also told that we would recognize the signs of the times between the geopolitical makeup and the technology and what society is doing. I recognize world government. And a world religion, and the ability for the Jewish people to do their sacrifice on a wing of the temple are difficult things to overcome. But I think things are moving in a position where all those things can happen in a fairly short period of time if the right cataclysms or the right coming together events permit it. But that also requires the removal of the restrainer as well. So.
Well, when it comes to the Third Temple, it's interesting because I was listening to a show. I actually produced a show with Pastor Casper McLeod and Pastor Paul Begley. And Paul Begley spends a lot of time in Jerusalem. And he talks to a lot of the top rabbis. And he had an interesting conversation there where one of the top rabbis basically insinuated that they have the Ark of the Covenant. They have it. Yeah. And all they really need to do, they have everything for the Third Temple is prefabbed, ready to go. All they have to do is put it up. We're not talking about some mega stone structure, It doesn't have to be that. And so they're ready to go. As soon as they have the place, they have everything. Once it's set up, they're ready to roll. So literally, it can happen quick.
You have two paths to how the sacrifice can be done. One, if you sort of think a little bit about what Daniel says, where the sacrifice is done on the wing of a temple, is that on the wing of the Dome of the Rock?
Yeah.
But what I tend to think is that the location of the Dome of the Rock is not the location where the temple was. It's right beside it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Josephus's instructions, who again lived there at that time, he's very specific, and that would put it just a very short distance from the Dome of the Rock along that rock ridge.
So it's doable.
It's almost like that crescent sort of thing that goes down into the valley. And so if he's correct and the understanding of his directions are correct, then that temple could be built there.
Huh. Yeah, Gary, we are living in some amazing times. It doesn't scare me a lot. I know a lot of people get scared. I don't know why. If you believe what the Bible says, you know where you're going. Whatever. I just think that we are been given the privilege of being alive in some very, very interesting times, and we're going to see where it goes. But another amazing show, my friend. I appreciate you coming on. I learned so much every time. I can't ever get over. I like how you really lay out for me how all these things are so intricately put together, and the layers and the layers and the layers, and they're very, very smart. And they are very, very patient, and they've been doing this since the beginning of time, And so they have a game plan. They're probably they're probably way more invested than most Christians are, unfortunately. So I would say that we need to step our game up as Christians and get invested, because this is a war in the spirit, not in the flesh, and they're not playing. This is real, and so it is just fascinating stuff.
And they plan to destroy Christianity as we know it and rebuild it and overlay it with polytheism and deceive even the elect if that were possible. And
sure,
seemingly it will be. So if you're not totally entrenched in what the Bible says and in your faith, you will be deceived.
Absolutely. Well, Gary, I thank you so much for coming on. Let's give everybody an idea of where they can find all your stuff. I know they can go to Amazon.com to find your books. They can go to Barnes & Noble, pretty much any Christian bookstore, and probably some secular bookstores. Your book is there. And then if they want to go to Genesis6Conspiracy.com, they can get an autographed copy directly from you. And they can find you on Facebook, on Twitter. What other information they need to have, Gary?
Yeah, and if the store says they don't know where to get the book, they just have to Google up onto Bookmasters and go through their inventory. It's available to that store if you want to buy it from them. It's available on most online bookstores. Twitter, you can follow me at Gary Wayne 63 at Gary Wayne 63. Also on Facebook under Gary Wayne. I also have 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages, and I do try and put out some interesting posts. At least once a week, and also very enlightening. I get a lot of good responses to them, and also I post all of my interviews on Facebook, and I'm working a little bit with Instagram under Gary Wayne as well, and obviously Genesis6Conspiracy.com. And if you do get a hold of me, I will get back to you.
Excellent. Yeah, and if they're on our website for some reason, castamoffradio.com, we do have a link directly to your book on Amazon. So, and that's been up there since our first interview, and it's not going away. So that will be there. Gary, thanks again for coming on. It's always so enlightening, and I just enjoy our conversations. And you're obviously always welcome back.
Well, thank you, and I think we'll do another show, and I think we'll have some other interesting things to talk about down the road. Excellent.
All right, guys, those of you listening and those of you watching, thank you, God bless you, and we'll talk to you next week. Cast 'Em Off Radio, Fringe Files, is a production of Cast 'Em Off Ministries. Visit us at castemoffradio.com. This program is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Music by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com.